that I think one of the things I noticed in the literature, the secondary literature, not only did they complain about the original, which I think it means that like, not even complain to the show. The question is, not is he original, but is he talking? Is it true? Does he recognise something real? And I think Michelle is bang on with many of the things that he says. The other thing that they complain about is that why does he call it the like it's a bit non-specific? He claims to be scientific, but actually he's not scientific. He's kind of vague in his terms, and calls it the iron law. Why is it the law? So one of the things I wanted to just mention in my little bit here. The reason it's an iron law is because there are, Joe will mention the 5 factors. You've got the mechanically impossible, it's technically impossible, it's practically impossible, okay? And then on top of that, you get 2 psychological factors, the gentle operator, Gustave Le Bon, which is the psychology of the psychology of the crowds. The crowd is seen to be this kind of almost pathetic entity that can't organise. It's always messy, always leaders, useless. And this is something that I need to and in fact I think that the pandemic has made it much more clear. Most people are just what we call APC, local program, basically. These tools are actually messes. And they are but then the flip side of it, there's this kind of idea that as soon as you get a taste of power, regardless of your motivations for getting into whatever it is in the first place, you'll start to become seduced by power itself. You'll start caring more about maintaining your position than any kind of ideological. And that is something that's he was talking about something. He was talking about how basically any of the socialists who take the power sold out. Sold out the principles to maintain their respectability. So I think it's especially an issue on the right of Step 21. How do you deal with this? I constantly battle with what I call the Tory war. But this is the issue. Right? Everybody, whether they're coming from the left or the right, everybody basically once they join up to one of these organisations, if it gets established, if it becomes part of the status quo, then you get the Tory war problem. Everything you start attracting that sort of person, and it seems to be like an intractable issue. And then yes, I think that was. Where else was I going with that? The final thing I wanted to say is that the reason it's an iron law is because you have these 5 factors, and you need to defeat all 5 of them to break the law. Okay, so let's just pretend you've got you solve this problem of the crowd being supine and leaders being like corruptible. Okay, so you actually had like perfect platonic leaders, and you had like I don't know, you had like a crowd of people who had like perfect information. Okay, you still have the problem of mechanics, the practical factors of organization he talks about. You have the technical issue to deal with, and you have the and then you have the tactical issue to deal with. So you need to like resolve all 5 of them, and that is, it's practically impossible. That's why it's the iron law of and then the final thing I wanted to say is that one of the things I appreciate about Michelle's, and one of the things that annoys political scientists, writing journals and things like that, is that they complain that he's a little bit messy, right? He claims to be scientific, but there are 5 factors here, not just 1. But I think that this, if he's never monochord, he's always saying, well, actually, there are 4 or 5 different reasons this is happening. I think that's a strength, where a lot of people want, I guess, like logical neatness. They wanted to say, no, this one's prime, or it's just this one thing. And that's been one of my bugbears in academia in general, where somebody has a thesis, and then they want everything to conform to that one idea and that one cause. I mentioned this the other day. Jared Diamond is an example, right? The idea that geography and environment would shape how human society develop is good, right? It's not bad. It makes sense. It has explanatory power. But Diamond wants it to explain everything, like absolutely everything that has ever happened in history. And this is a problem that I think affects. I think it's to do with the individual incentive of scholars within academia. Anyway, I've spoken for long enough.
Most of my notes deal with the second half of this book, so I'll just very briefly go over the first half. Essentially, in the first half of the book, Michelle's is showing like structurally why liberal democracy fails in its stated intention, which originally the idea of the liberal democracy was to replace monarchy, replace various forms of hereditary aristocracy with like popular sovereignty, like rule by the people, no inherent hierarchy, a society based on consensus of the majority, and a structure in which anyone based on skill and popular appeal could rise to the top. And the argument Michels puts forward throughout most of this book is that that's just fundamentally impossible. What you have in liberal democracy is actually still just as much an aristocracy, except now it's an aristocracy of bureaucrats and technical managers who present a sort of a facade of democratic or progressive values to conceal what they're actually doing. Early on, he applies this with reference to conservative parties, where conservative parties, in their worldview and their ideological understanding of things, are explicitly more aristocratic and favorable towards hierarchy. But the nature of liberal democracy is such that they can't put themselves forward as that, so they need to present themselves as being progressive and present themselves as being populist, and even in a certain sense revolutionary, which is why you see phenomenon even today where like the American Republican Party will say that it's actually more progressive and less racist and more tolerant than the left. You know, the American right will say these things. But for much of the book, he's actually focusing more on the Socialist Party, in part because he has socialist sympathies himself, and in part because the Socialist Party, ideologically at least, is the one that's most committed to the democratic ideal. It's the one that's the most opposed to hierarchy, to oligarchy, to managerial elites. And yet you see the same phenomenon occurring with leftist parties, with socialist parties. And what Michels wants to do is, to show that these oligarchic tendencies emerge inevitably, even in the parties that are ostensibly most opposed to oligarchy, because this law of oligarchy is something that just structurally inevitably occurs as a result of trying to organize a large number of people in order to get something done. Inevitably, you're going to have a managerial elite who become increasingly detached from the rest of the population. And this has nothing to do with the elite being evil, or having some sort of special power, or having some sort of historical luck that allowed them to seize power and retain it indefinitely. Rather, it's just a simple scientific law of human organization, similar to a triangle having three sides. Organization leads to oligarchy, inevitably. Sorry, I have a cold. So he talks quite a bit about that in the first half of the book, the structural tendencies that lead to these sorts of things. In the second half of the book, he gets more into the psychology of the individual, the psychology of class relations, specifically in the socialist sense, but also how this oligarchic tendency creates and recreates endlessly class structure and class strata, and how these class strata are more complex than the simple Marxian view of the bourgeois versus the proletariat. So basically, one moment. You see this oligarchic tendency initiated by the need for organization, but is accelerated by basic tendencies of human nature. On the one hand, you have the masses who, as academic agents said, are by nature apathetic and unable to do anything. This is just a biological tendency of human beings. When you have a large group of people, without someone overseeing them, they are basically organized by the lowest common denominator. They're irrational, they're easy to manipulate, and it's difficult to get them to coordinate in any fashion. So if you have a large mass of people, such as any large modern civilization, or any large modern political party, you need someone to guide them. And on the other hand, you have leaders who have a natural, again this is just a basic human tendency, a natural lust for power and an enjoyment of ruling over others. So this initially could begin, someone becomes a leader, they say they rise up from the working class. Initially they become detached from the masses for idealistic reasons. It's usually they get put into a leader role because they are more willing to make sacrifices to do the difficult work of being a leader. They have a clearer vision of what the party stands for. They are more passionate about the cause of socialism or whatever party it is, and they have a genuine desire for good. But because of this, they become removed from everyone else. They get into this position after a long struggle to do something in the name of cause, and once they're in that position, they're disinclined to ever give it up. I mean, it's something they've obtained as a result of struggle, and it would take a truly, a Christ-like individual, basically, to be able to sacrifice something that they have worked hard for their whole lives for some greater ideological good. So once someone's gotten into a leadership position, they become aware of the fact that the masses are apathetic, they won't get anything done for themselves, they require guidance. They recognize that the reason why they're in this position is because they have a certain degree of superiority. And this all contributes to awaken the spirit of command within them. Furthermore, once they've been in this position of leadership for a while, they're ill-equipped to do anything else. And this is something that Michels gets into in the first half of the book, is that once you're placed in a leadership position, you start to become trained in the technical mechanisms of the party. Your worldview begins to shift from what it was formerly. A leader who emerged from the working class, let's say they were a skilled trade worker, now, when they're in the leadership position of the Socialist Party, they're no longer applying themselves to their trade. They're studying political minutiae all day. They lose their mechanical abilities. If a leader emerges from, say, the sciences, they lose track of how their field is progressing. So basically, wherever in the world the leader emerged from initially, once they're in the leadership role, that's consuming all of their time, all of their energy. They lose whatever other skills they had and they become personally only able to act as a leader. Along with this, there's a tendency over a sufficient period of time, once you've been exposed to all of the daily struggles and the dull mundanities of overseeing a large political organization, the contrivances, there's a tendency for your idealism to wane. Your old romantic idealistic vision from youth that initially motivated you to get involved in this political cause is gradually replaced with just the day-to-day struggle of power games. So inwardly, most leaders after a sufficient period of time are quite estranged from whatever cause it was that initially motivated them, say socialism, even though outwardly they still need to put on this facade of being the faithful comrade, being the idealistic self-sacrificing hero that the masses need, because the masses have a religious need to look up to someone great. This is, again, another human tendency. So they present themselves this way outwardly, but internally they increasingly become skeptics, they become materialists, they become guided by cold calculation. This varies from individual to individual, obviously. In many cases, they see this personal transformation as really just a maturing process. They become aware of the complexities of the situation, and they have to overcome some of their old idealism in order to more realistically assess the actual possibilities. But what this translates to practically is that they become mature. And likewise, people typically tend to be more moral, more ideologically driven during struggle, during difficulty, when you are the oppressed group, when you're on the bottom rung of society, and you have this great tyrannical force from your perspective that you're fighting against. That's quite romantic, that's quite ideologically motivating. As soon as you've started to gain some control, either as a social force or even just individually, there's a decline in moral conviction. And we see this especially with socialist leaders who rise up from the working class, where even though by and large the working class is still fighting for its rights, the individual who becomes a leader is themselves somewhat ascended. They become bourgeois somewhat themselves. So personally, they have less of that fire. They have less of that deep burning need to overcome oppression, because their own day-to-day reality is that they themselves are living much better than they were initially. So psychologically, logically, they might still understand the struggle, but personally, emotionally, that's no longer the case for them. So from here, he gets into the phenomenon of how this originated. He looks quite a bit at the French Revolution, at what he calls Bonapartism. And this section looks very similar to the Juveniles on Power, where you see during the French Revolution the emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte, who personifies himself as a leader of the people, who is doing things in the name of the people, who is entirely motivated by the will of the people. This is basically what you see throughout modern democracy, is this framing of the ruling elites as simply being the tools of the masses. This leads to a number of interesting psychological phenomena. Once a leader personifies himself as just the voice of the majority, he's able to frame any resistance to his will as being anti-democratic, as being against the people. He's able to exterminate his adversaries in the name of the people. He's able to justify any sort of repressive measure he wants to use, any sort of force, any sort of concentration of authority into his own hands as being the will of the people, because the people voted him into office. He's able to crush any sort of opposition group as being against the people. He's able to take any sort of popular movement and isolate it. And so in this way, you can have a small minority, a single individual perhaps, who is able to frame himself as being the voice of the majority, and to take what might actually be a majority opposition and break it up into these isolated groups, and to defeat them in the name of the masses. And also because of this, it makes it so that anyone who's a middleman, anyone who is a bureaucrat in the power system, is required to pledge allegiance to the centralizing force, because if they don't, then they also are going against the people. So it's a very consensus breeding process. And once it's got going, it's very difficult to end this, because in theory, if the people could vote for anything, they could vote to end popular sovereignty. They could vote to return to a formal monarchy, to an explicit aristocracy. But even this is kind of ruled out from the get-go, because in theory, you could have one generation that votes to end popular democracy, but this would be seen as being unjust to future generations. So there's this kind of compulsion to maintain popular democracy in the name of the future, right? So like the only thing that popular sovereignty can't do is end itself. But basically, this process gives the masses the illusion of being in charge, which makes them submit more readily to power, because it frames being a power they enacted themselves. Again, another Juvenilean point that's made here is that in the monarchy, to disobey the monarch is to sin against God, because the monarch has been appointed by God. Within a democracy, to disobey the democracy is to sin against the people. The leader bases his right to command on the supposed omnipotence of the people. But really, the people have very little power. They have the power to, let's say in America, go to the polls every 4 years and pick one of two choices to rule over them. And their choice is heavily informed by media manipulation, by selective framing of the issues, by the fact that the average person just has a very weak understanding of politics by necessity, because it's a very complex subject, and most people, they have their personal lives to attend to. They don't have time to become political specialists. So the actual participation of the individual in the democratic process is basically just entirely illusory. Where does it go from here? he talks about how bureaucrats within the party will use various manipulative tactics. He will confound his own interest with the interests of the party. When the party is criticized, he'll take it as a personal attack, whereas when he is personally criticized, he will frame it as an attack on the party. He say it's ideologically driven. He will frame his opponent as an enemy of the party, and basically get all of the party adherents on board with defending his personal will as if it were the ideological tenets of socialism or whatever it is he claims to represent. And this has a certain purpose because, again, as Michelle has lined up in the first half of the book, in order to be an efficient political bureaucracy, in order to actually get things done, the more dictatorial you are, the more you manage the machine. This is, again, just a scientific law of large group organization. But it does leave a problem. A bureaucrat typically thinks that he understands the masses better than they do themselves. He introduces a conservative tendency where he resists anyone that opposes his will. But at the end of the day, even though he is a skilled bureaucrat and he has quite a few technical capabilities, he is just one man. The fact of the matter is that he might be in the wrong. He might be on the wrong side of history. Certainly in many cases he'll be on the wrong side of popular opinion. So he's able to resist what might otherwise be a natural evolution of society because he personally has a particular vision and he's gotten in this position of power and he's able to maintain certain stratifications much longer than they would have endured otherwise. This is something he gets into. He talks about the stratification of class society, and he does kind of frame this in terms of the typical socialist idea of the bourgeois and the proletarians, where the proletarian masses are slow to react to social change, and they'll typically endure worn-out conditions long after their expiry date, because the class representing the elite ruling forces of a previous era, in this case the bourgeois, are able to maintain a certain moral prestige and a certain political force long after the point where they actually stop representing the most powerful material force in society. Because of this, the masses, who do, in the socialist view, represent the most powerful material force in society, are unable to actually ascend and take control of society until forces from the higher classes help them to do this. Basically, the masses by themselves are just instinctual, they're disorganized, they don't fully understand the situation. What they require is members of the bourgeois to organize them, to scientifically, theoretically, politically, ideologically guide them. And this is for a number of reasons. If you think back, like when this book was written over 100 years ago, university education was much less common. It was really only members of the upper classes who had a deep understanding of philosophy, of political tactics, of history, etc., etc. So bourgeois dissenters who joined the working class movements were able to provide a sort of theoretical foundation of what was previously just like an instinctual compulsion. But beyond this, the very fact that members of the bourgeois would turn to socialism gives it a sort of objective weight. Because socialism is something that is disadvantageous to their class, right? Like within the socialist worldview, the bourgeois are basically going to get advantage, going to lose their advantage. And the fact that certain members of the bourgeois, of the upper class, begin to see the ideological validity of socialism suggests that there's something more to it than simple greed of the proletariat. He gets into why a member of the bourgeois might be against socialism. Basically, there's just a disgust with the unending struggle, the ongoing sense of a violent revolution brewing. There's this need for sort of an idealistic vision that can be shared by everyone. And in general, there's this feeling that no one wants to live amongst a ruined society, right? Like, you might be a member of the bourgeois, but if 90% of society is just falling totally in despair, that limits somewhat your ability to enjoy life, your ability to, envision a long-term future for your society. And this is a key component of social revolution, Michelle's this idea that once the ruling classes begin to lose faith in their own ideological vision, so the bourgeois vision, it signifies the onset of their own political decay. Once they begin to hear the validity of their adversaries' arguments, that signifies the ascent of the new class, in this case the proletarian uprising. Now, this has its limits, right? There's this idea within socialism that they want to persuade the bourgeois of the validity of their ideological position, the socialist position. And this will work on individuals. Certain individuals of a poetic or perhaps a self-sacrificing sentimental mindset will be won over to the socialist cause. But a class as a whole will not be won over. A class as a whole, again, is kind of like a crowd. It's not driven by ideological ideals. It's driven by economic determinism. A ruling class will not just voluntarily give up its position of privilege. Individuals of that class might. Certain members of the bourgeois might become leaders of the socialist movement, but the class as a whole will not just voluntarily destruct itself. So anyway, where does he go from here? He talks about the different kinds of proletarian leadership, the different motivations that there would be, how these groups are not homogenous, how there is a bourgeois element within the proletariat. You have certain proletarians who become petty bourgeois themselves, become shopkeepers who basically parasitically live off the proletarian by, demanding that their comrades support them in business, that they buy their inferior products, that they shop local, etc., etc. Was there any other key points I wanted to make, though? I think you guys have covered most of what I wanted to say. I'm just going to go check to see if there was any... Okay, so at the end of the book, after he's established the inability of, a true democracy to be established. How once, even if a socialist party came into power, it wouldn't be able to instill true democracy. At best, it could just become this massive party bureaucracy that could incorporate more and more of the population into the mechanism of the party in order to give them a somewhat elevated social position. His ultimate conclusion, because he does come off as being pro-democracy in theory, is that there's still some validity in fighting for democracy, even if it's like this impossible ideal to realize. Because in theory, the ideal form of human structure would be as if you had an aristocracy that was genuinely just the most competent and the most moral segment of society. If you had your perfect AI or your alien race that was like above petty human concerns, or if God himself came down out of heaven and ruled over Earth, this would be the ideal, but that doesn't occur in the real world. Very rarely you might have a great king or something, but eventually he dies and he passes it down to his son, and it's unlikely that the son will be as good as his father. So forgetting that idealistic impossibility, what Michel's ultimately concludes is that there is some validity in endlessly fighting for democracy, even if it's impossible to realize. Because in the fight for democracy, you stave off some of the worst authoritarian tendencies of aristocracy, and by striving to elevate the general education level of the masses, you do promote a degree of democratic inclination. So he sees it basically as this endless kind of struggle between aristocracy and democracy, where neither one totally wins out, but it's a struggle worth continuing, because as long as you're fighting for democracy, if you are a pro-democratic individual, you don't necessarily ever achieve it, but you might be able to improve it. So that's more or less some of the basic points I had, so I'm gonna pass it back to you guys now.
Okay, so what I found that was interesting was that third section, fourth section, book, where he talks about Bonapartism. He, interestingly, he kind of describes Bonapartism or Caesarism with a certain amount of contempt and cynicism, even though he does also describe, well, we kind of have this bureaucracy that forms, and it becomes about people defending their status within this established, institutionalized structure. And so if we have the Caesar that can take his mandate directly from the people and rule with an iron fist, the strongman, the populist dictator, if you will, he can shake things up, he can make radical change, because he rules with an extreme amount of legitimacy. And obviously this is very similar to Mussolini and the whole fascist ideology, the concept that the national will, like in the philosophy of Giovanni Gentile, the whole concept that the national will becomes personalized in this spiritual avatar, which is the leader of the state, namely Mussolini. So it's very interesting that his view moved, because it definitely seems like it's incompatible with the sentiment that he lays out in this text. I haven't read anything else by Michel. I haven't read any of his later writings, his justification for his conversion to fascism. I find it interesting, though, that there is that departure. Whether it was a cynical departure, or this is just like the best of the alternatives, or whether his thought genuinely developed from this text.
Yeah, I don't actually know. I haven't been able to find any kind of anything on that. For various different reasons, obviously, people working on Michel's, after 1945, they either want to save these thinkers from the charge of being fascists. So you get all of these kind of hilarious kind of cope articles. Well, actually, Michel really was pro-democracy. There's tons of articles like that saying actually this, if you really understand what he's saying, he's actually for democracy, guys. So you get quite a lot of articles along those sorts of lines. But I haven't really. I mean, as far as I can understand, he basically blackpilled himself into being fascist. There is that one passage on the I don't know if it's in the Bonapartist section, but he basically talks about how when he's talking about the psychology of the crime, that you basically need what does he write? I've got the exact quote here. He says, "The most striking proof of the organic weakness of the race is furnished by the way in which, when deprived of the leaders in time of action, they abandon the field of battle, disordered flight. They seem to have no power of instinctive reorganization and are useless until new captains arrive capable of replacing those that have been lost." So you'd think with that sort of and to me, by the way, one of the things that I found reading it this time is how many of these things I recognise in contemporary politics. Like that really reminded me of January the 6th. Pride of leaders in a time of action. I mean, I don't want to talk about I don't do rank punditry, but the image of Donald Trump sneaking off on his helicopter when his crowd needed him, and then look at the state, the actual state of the masses when there's no organisational principle there. If that makes any sense. They literally got to the Capitol and Spake Alaska taking selfies of him, taking pictures of himself. So yeah, I find it interesting that he ends up as not just a Mussolini supporter, the card-carrying member of the fascist party. Even Pareto didn't go that far. In fact, Pareto turned down various different things that were offered to him by Mussolini, and he died, of course. Whereas Michel, as far as I can tell, was of the three elite theorists, the one who was he was fully on board. And it's especially interesting because Mussolini, I believe, you guys know it better than me, when he came to power, he stood in that square in Rome, and didn't he say, "I come for one thing and one thing only. I want to lead. I want to be the leader." He didn't say, "I'm doing it for justice. I'm doing it for the people. I'm doing." He just said, I want to be in charge, basically." which I find like almost, you can almost see the influence of the elite theorist on the leader, and he's so kind of nakedly transparent as to just kind of almost like demystify. I mean, you can talk about the myths he tried to erect afterwards, but I just think, in that moment, it's very rare for somebody to not obscure wanting power in something. Usually, there is at least a song. I mean, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Shakespeare's Richard III, but Richard III has this whole charade where he gathers this crowd, and then he stands on the balcony and pretends to read the Bible. And they were like, "Oh, come on, we need somebody to be king." He's like, "I couldn't possibly. I'm a good holy man. I want to return to my studies. No, come on, we need to." He was like, "Okay, go on, then. Go on. I'll be the. If I must, I'll be the king." And you still see leaders do that whole charade because there needs to be some kind of, appeal to sovereignty, if you want. But it must be easy to do that.
An interesting thing that I got reading this text is the historical context. As I'm reading it, and he's showing the inevitability of this sort of hierarchy formation, this elite strata, and how there's no getting around this. There is this like unspoken question I feel throughout, where it's like, well, if this is inevitable, why don't we just try making it explicit? Why don't we just run with it? Why don't we lean into it? And instead of like concealing it with all of this false, not even like well concealed, I feel like even the average person these days kind of at least has like an intuitive sense that democracy is like it's a facade. It doesn't really work, and like maybe most people still think that it could work, but there's definitely like an understanding that what we have isn't really a democracy. It's like a bureaucracy that kind of maintains its own interests. So I can certainly see like the Italian socialists who became the Italian fascists perhaps being inspired by this sort of material, reading it and saying like, well, what if we just went totally masked off? What if we just like made this really out in the open, correct? We removed all this false ideological nonsense from like an older era, all of these like early bourgeois liberal ideals that sounded good on paper but didn't really work out on practice. What if we just binned all of that and keep the actual mechanism of power that we've come to recognize more explicitly, and see if perhaps that works a little bit better? And that's the feeling I got from reading this.
It fits into this overarching view, which I've been calling the state-centric theory of the political, which is in contrast to particularly Marxist views, but any kind of in my paper in the third issue of my journal, Personus, I talk about like the three fundamental sociological mistakes or social scientific mistakes that I see being made in general discourse, but other dissident rights. The three were the autocratic theory of government, like the idea that the person that's in charge of an institution somehow expresses full agency of that institution as opposed to other structural processes inherent to that institution. Economic determinism, like the idea that the formation of the elite, the formation of the political order is driven by economic incentives and economic classes, and the democratic theory of policy creation. Now, this is a very good refutation of democratic theory of policy creation, but it also fits into this more overarching theme, I think, of rejecting economic determinism and autocratic theories of government, because what it demonstrates is that the ruling class, its production has shifted into this new form, that essentially what has occurred with modernity is that, basically like political organization has changed. We've switched into this bureaucratic society, and bureaucracy is not just the state. I mean, all large corporations have bureaucracies. Like if you work for a large corporation and you have to deal with the HR department, at some point, you know exactly what I mean. So all large corporations are bureaucracies, political parties are bureaucracies, any large institution necessarily develops this impersonal structure. And so the interaction between these institutions, what I call the institutional theory of society, this develops the overall structure of the political, and this is why I say the political is determined not by economic factors, but by security factors, in the sense that institutions exist necessarily in relation to other institutions, and so they have to reinforce themselves within the interinstitutional environment that makes up society. And obviously the state being the kind of dominant sovereign central institution, although it itself is made up of many like sub-institutions, like different bureaucratic departments or extra governmental organizations like NGOs or political parties or whatever. All these institutions exist in this complex interrelationship, and so they need to basically reinforce their position relative to one another. And this is kind of Michel's point, that once you develop a political party, its relation to the state, to other institutions in society, take over from whatever the ideological mission that originally set it up. Like, we're going to have this critique of society, we're not happy with this, we're not happy with that, we want to make these social changes. But then as it starts to develop, the whole point of the political party becomes securing itself in this interinstitutional relationship. It becomes security becomes its primary concern, or it's kind of like retaining itself, which is what Michel calls the inherent conservative tendency within organization. And so this is interesting, I think, because as we shift from feudalism to modernity, generally the narrative goes, we had feudal society, there was an aristocracy, there was the church, and then we have this process whereby, okay, we have the emergence of absolutist monarchs and capitalist elites, and so the absolutist monarch BTFOs the aristocracy and the church, and then leaves himself weak, so then he gets BTFO'd by the bourgeois elites, and now we live underneath the rule of, finance capital or something. This is BS. Really, what you can see here is that these moves towards absolutism and bourgeois liberalism, or quote-unquote capitalism, this isn't actually what's going on. What's going on here is a move from the kind of aristocracy in the church forming the ruling class, being replaced by academia and the new political elite, the new technocracy, coming to replace it. And the processes of capitalism and absolutist monarchy, these are just facades. These are images that appear on the outside like they're really what's going on. But actually, there is a more fundamental shift in actually how the ruling class is being developed here. There's intermediary phases in this transition. And so that's key, because the absolutist monarchs, they derive their authority from massive bureaucracies and the development of academic structures. So if you particularly with quote-unquote enlightened absolutism, you see this with the British monarchy, where obviously they Henry VIII breaks from the Catholic Church, founds the Church of England, but more importantly, the Royal Society is established by the British monarchy that justifies, that develops liberal political science, that develops literally people like Francis Bacon and so forth. Oh, sorry, not Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon and so forth. They establish they take it from earlier British theologians like the nominalists. They take this empiricist angle to producing a new way of organizing academia outside of the church, kind of secularized academia that produces independent political sciences and can give rise to ultimately a new political class. And so the monarch, in kind of overthrowing the church, he just replaces the church with academia, and ultimately academia produces a whole bunch of parliamentarian, anti-monarchic ideologies that end up basically cucking the monarchs. So this idea that the absolutist monarchs were never really in charge, it's an illusion. And the same thing with capitalism. The bourgeois elites come in and they take over from the old aristocracy. But ultimately, in order for them to set themselves up, they need to subordinate themselves to the production of this liberal democratic state. And then the liberal democratic states that get developed, that they support, they ultimately create these massive bureaucratic edifices that socialists come into, and they start appropriating all these resources from the economic system, and they start completely ripping apart the bourgeois values of the late 18th, early 19th century, and building the modern world of massive, kind of universalizing the franchise and bureaucratizing everything to build the modern bureaucratic state. And so Michels is a key theorist in this I think, true alt narrative of how shit actually works in terms of developing the modern political. And I put him up there with people like Juvenel, the other elite theorists, obviously, people that I cover on this channel, basically, as this kind of counter-tradition to the kind of dominant meme, so to speak, that are floating around that actually give you the truth about the political. So anyway, I'll throw it to you.
No, I was just going to say on Francis Bacon, I don't know if you're aware that he wrote this kind of utopian fiction called New Atlantis. In fact, Thomas More wrote Utopia, and if you have a look at how Utopia functions, it's pretty technocratic. But Bacon's New Atlantis is very technical. He basically puts the scientists, it's like a kind of scientific theocracy in a sense. He puts the scientists in charge, and it's this it's this kind of technocratic state, which is very interesting. That is the way that in fact, it's not minimal the way the system that we have now. It only I suppose in New Atlantis there wouldn't be a Congress or a president. It would just be Dr. Fauci or something.
Yeah, but that's what American progressivism was ultimately the realization of, was the self-awareness of this technical managerial elite in the American political system. And ultimately, the New Deal was them cucking, having that final victory, that total victory over the bourgeois liberal order. That they already had victories building up to that, obviously, from Teddy Roosevelt's administration, various other moves, things like the suffragette movement, the universalization of the franchise, but ultimately they commandeered the economy and the total organization of the state. And this goes along with the World War, Second World War in particular, where you have total war, where the entire bureaucratic organization of society has to be geared toward this industrial war effort that occurs across the world, not just in the United States, obviously. Juvenal makes this point that this is the awakening of the state, where you have this process that occurs as we kind of break out of medieval feudalism of competitive centralization, where the structure of these different states, they have no choice but to out-centralize each other, otherwise they get BTFO'd by the states that do a better job.
Now on the point of convergence within society, within let's say FDR in America or Britain or any other country, in my lecture, which is going to be in Foundation of Politics, I had a whole paragraph where I'm not really critical, but I kind of think that this is an element that is missing in the theorists. Let me just read it to you and see what you guys, how you guys react, okay? Because you may well change my mind if you think I missed something here. I say the value of Michels is in his many insights into practical on-the-ground politics and the realities of organisation. His chief contribution is to see what Moscow and Troika said on the level of whole countries is also true at the level of large organisations. However, because his analysis is focused on individual organizations in microcosm, he does not give us, crucially, the relationship between organizations, or how leaders in one organization respond to leaders in external organizations who are no direct threat to them. Is the tendency of elites in disparate organizations to diverge in rivalrous competition, or to converge as people with largely similar interests and goals? Recall, for example, Nick Clegg leading the Liberal Democrat Party to join Facebook. I got a section earlier on where basically Michelle's talking about, how once you enter into that kind of ruling class, you kind of work towards your own interests rather than the interests of the interests that kind of got you there. And the reason I use Nick Clegg is because he, in 2010, he ran on an election pledge to abolish tuition fees. Even I voted for him back in 2010, right? But that was one of the reasons that I wanted tuition fees to be gone at that time. And he basically the Tory party did not have enough to form a government at that time. So there was this coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And one of the first things they did when they got in power is put up the tuition fees at £9,225. So he did the exact opposite of what he pledged to do once he was actually in power, which I thought was a very neat demonstration of Michelle's point. That the myth of representative democracy is shown in the fact that these people almost never do, what they said they would. As soon as the realities of power begin. Anyway, these questions would be left for James Burnham and Samuel T. Francis to flesh out, and we can return to them later. For now, I will say in passing that Mosca gives us the category of feudal and bureaucratic with which to think about this problem on state level. If large institutions in disparate fields, for example, a political party and a corporation, become more rivalrous, it is a sign of feudalization, which is to say competing power centres. If they are on the opposite trajectory towards convergence, we might say it is a sign of bureaucratization, or even, in Mosca's phrase, over-bureaucratization. Michelle's provides a whole chapter himself on this topic called Bureaucracy, Centralization, and Decentralization Tendencies. But this offers no significant advance on Mosca, that finds itself too bogged down in the minutiae of the contemporary German socialist scene of 1911. He does complain entertainingly, however, about the problem of bureaucratic specialization, leading to mundane, career-seeking, obsequious men who know nothing of bigger ideas or principles. Bureaucratization suppresses the individuality and gives the society in which employees predominate in a narrow, petty, bourgeois, philistine state. The bureaucratic spirit corrupts character and engenders moral poverty. Thus, within bureaucratization is a degenerative principle, degenerative in the general quality of the personnel who form the non-governing elite. And that could sow seeds of a move towards decentralization by generating disaffected but more visionary types who agitate for change. And we can see in this something of Pareto's circulation of the elites, and this is also the seed of an idea that will be done bio-Leninism by the blogger Spandrel in 2018, whereby these key bureaucratic roles are filled based more on loyalty to the party than for their actual skills. In Michelle's terms, what is really happening is they are weakening one of the key pillars on which the Iron Lord depends, the practical abilities of the leaders to organise. If too many mundane specialists become totally sycophants, then the advantage of the leaders is lost. So yeah, I wanted to read that because I thought it got into a few interesting things there. And I was wondering what you guys thought. Am I being a bit harsh on Mosca, on Michelle, and on Mosca, indeed, when I say that they don't really give us this element of how are these disparate organisations interacting with each other?
I agree with you, but also I guess things were different in 1911, and he's focused on the socialist movement than it is now, where in those days there was influence of non-government organisations, so to speak, but foundations and so forth. But I think this is something that really came online in a far more intense way in the 20th century, where there are all these other entities in what I call the policy-making apparatus. You think about all the different entities around, like the Republican Party in the United States, like the Federalist Society that handles jurisprudence, like the Heritage Foundation, the National Conservatism Conference that just happened the other day, like the Claremont Institute, all these different groups that have different positions, the Cato Institute and so forth. There's heaps, right? There's just countless institutions. They've got a DC superstructure. Like these institutions, they are all separate, but they have to form a kind of orthodoxy. And there's obviously, like there are different factions, that are trying to pull the Republican Party in different directions, but they still have to kind of get together and form an orthodoxy, kind of policy orthodoxy, that eventually becomes like the Republican Party's, policies. They're kind of, obviously, if you're in like an actual congressman, you don't write the legislation. In most cases, you don't even read it. I remember like Rand Paul tried to put a bill through American Congress 10 years ago or so called the Read Bill Act to kind of implore congressmen to actually read bills before they vote on them, and it failed. They don't want to actually read stuff. They don't write it. They don't even read it, but they vote on it. So who's writing it? Someone. So there is this massive bureaucratic superstructure of different institutions that are producing this. Producing these policies and churning out the actual legislation and the agenda, and this legions of strategists and kind of election experts and focus group researchers and statistical analysts and all kinds of things that go into the massive political industry. and they're all trying to maintain their position within the GOP, and so they might have certain hostilities to one another. Different, like if there's two different institutions that are trying to pull. You can see right now with the Republicans, they're trying to push this kind of multiracial, populist, economic nationalism, as Steve Bannon calls it. And there's like, you know, the Claremont Institute guys, there's Tucker Carlson, there's Steve Bannon, there's a whole bunch of guys like this that are pushing the Republican Party in this direction. But then there's also the Cato Institute guys that reject this and say, no, this is socialism. We need to have, so there are still these differences. So they're competing with one another, but then overall, like an orthodoxy has to form. They have to align themselves with an orthodoxy to get by. Otherwise, if they're existing in, like if I create a think tank with radical far-right ideology, I'm not part of an orthodoxy, and so they're all just going to attack me as a racist, and the ADL are going to make all these, all these hit pieces on me, and all these journalists are going to pull these hit pieces on me, and no one's going to take me seriously. Maybe like one fringe congressman will take me seriously or something, and that's it. So you have to kind of fit yourself into this network of institutional relationships, and I got this idea from Mearsheimer when talking about structural realism in international relations, and it struck me that structural realism being, you can't really understand individual state behaviors without understanding the relationship between states in the international system. And Mearsheimer goes as far as to completely disregarding the internal politics of any state, look purely into the structural relationships between states to make predictions. And he makes more effective predictions from a structural realist standpoint than people who focus on the internal dynamics of the ideologies of the various states and how they should predict and behave. I'm not that these things have no influence. And so when if you take that view and bring that into the state and say, well, what's the structural relationship between the institutions that make up the governing apparatus within a state? Again, I think there's some validity to this view, looking at the different relationships between these states, how they form together into orthodoxies, which are kind of like international alliances in a way. Like you could see like all the different institutions aligned with the Republican Party as being kind of like, like NATO or something, and the Democrat Party are like, the old Soviet Union or all their satellites or something. You could have a kind of like a similarity here where that's how these in the kind of institutional system they fit together. It's something like this in Michelle's.
It strikes me though, Joel, that the relationship between countries is somewhat anarchic, I suppose, or there is a kind of more Hobbesian dog-eat-dog element to it. Whereas when I look at the development of institutions within a country, I see a kind of I see a compliance culture and a convergence culture whereby the values inside a university become the values inside, let's say Facebook and Google become the values inside the Tory party, for example, and it doesn't really make a difference where
the values inside the United States become the values inside Australia, or the values inside Germany, or the values inside random African countries. So that's also true in the international system, because you have a dominant institution, or in the internal system, or a dominant nation state. That's in order to enter into coalition with that, because like if you're in the international system and you're like some random, fourth-rate country, because Mearsheimer makes this point as well, that like, you could have this Hobbesian view, but the Hobbesian view is false in the sense that, particularly in the modern world, most states are economically reliant on other states. So like most countries in the world can't actually produce their own weapons. They have to buy their weapons from the bigger countries that have their like massive weapons, industries. And most smaller countries also, they don't have the capacity to defend themselves from all the countries around them ganging up on them. So they need to go and get like a bigger friend that'll guarantee their security. And different things as well. Like a lot of states don't have enough natural resources; they have to import them from other countries and so forth. Whereas a big state like the United States has everything it needs, basically. The same with China has almost everything it needs, and Russia has these are very resource-rich, massive in terms of landmass nations, and so they're able to have more agency in the international system as a result, because they have massive populations, massive industries, massive sets of natural resources. So in the same way, I think this is true in the political system. So you could say that there's dominant institutions that are able to kind of push things in a particular direction. The smaller institutions have to fit themselves into those larger relationships. So obviously, like the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, Harvard, some of these, the CIA, like these really important institutions in the United States, they're obviously driving things in a far more direct way, and then these other smaller institutions have to fall in line.
Yeah, I guess the ultimate question though is, this has not always been the case, right? There have been cases. So at the moment, there's been this massive tendency towards convergence, centralization, everybody kind of coming together in this kind of even global compliance culture, whereby, as you mentioned, the values of the United States become the values of Austria or something, But at other times, that seems to go in reverse. You get popularization, you get institutions attacking each other, you get a tendency towards the feudalization, I guess. But I don't know what trick. Like, there's no, from the literature or from the elite theorists so far, I haven't really got a sense of what triggers the direction one way or the other.
Well, it seems to be, like, in a large extent, this is why I hold a security determinist view, reward punishment. So if you break with the orthodoxy, what are the punishments and what are the rewards? And so, in order for, because balkanization is not simply it's breaking off, because generally balkanization comes also with the production of a new local elite. So like if a country breaks, like when the Soviet Union broke apart, it wasn't like the ruling class of these former Soviet republics are all the same exact people that were administrating them under Soviet rule. There was a kind of new elites that formed in a lot of these countries. There was some kind of carryovers from the past that like defected but there was also and kind of institutions that were inherited by these new states, but also there was new elites that formed, new political movements that formed and asserted themselves. And so like that's also the case. I think when you see like with the United States right now, the United States is starting to like lose its capacity to punish and reward the international system for going along with this agenda. And so you saw, recently, like Angela Merkel basically told the Americans to fuck off, and we're gonna build Nord Stream 2, and we're gonna get gas from Russia. There was no way they would do that 20 years ago. No way.
And by the same token, do you think like Joe Biden and his administration or the oligarchy is unable to punish, I don't know, Florida man? Like, what can it do to Florida at this point? Because I do think we're seeing weaponization within the United States as well. In so much as there are these nodes of resistance that do not appear to be converging or complying. And I guess compliance culture will break down if you get whole districts of the country, whole states even, that just are refusing to go along with it.
But what it seems though is that the American elite have maxed out on psychological warfare capacity. Particularly, I think I was reading a paper the other day, I can't remember the name of the guy, but he worked in the State Department, and he wrote this paper in the early 90s talking about shift in American strategy. And he was invoking like chaos theory and like complexity theory to describe this shift in American imperial strategy, where America, he was saying, should pursue a strategy of sabotage and like the provoking what he called criticality, basically provoking, like looking at a state that already has certain tendencies of destabilization, like an enemy state, and instead of like trying to transplant the new elite to replace them, instead just like help along forces of destabilization so that the thing falls apart. And he was talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union and basically seeing this as a brand new era in American foreign policy where soft power, psychological warfare, diplomacy could be used to challenge America's enemies as opposed to fighting them, in a direct war, Vietnam style, which was a failure. And we saw this obviously, with Arab Spring and various other kinds of things that have happened in the time since. And so I think what happened is that the American elite was very good at psychological warfare, including on its own population. It's very good at controlling the flow of information and controlling public perception.
Yeah, I think they're called masters in the literature. There's a book that was brought out by the Hoover Institution by Harold White Laswell, Daniel Lerner, by Stanford University Press, came out in the 50s. Clearly this was documented read by government officials and people like that. And they talk in there about specialists in persuasion, and specialists in coercion, and they actually do a really quite in-depth elitist analysis of Soviet Union elites, and they show how the first generation of elites under Lenin were specialists in persuasion, but then they gave over to being specialists in coercion under Stalin. And they looked at their background, the sorts of people. So in effect, there was a circulation of elites within the Soviet Union from class 1s to class 2s in Pareto's terms. But it strikes me that our elites have been foxes. They've been class 1s, they've been specialists in persuasion for a very long time now. And we're getting to the point where, whether it's over the pandemic or over these issues internally or externally, they're going to have to use force sooner or later, right?
Yeah, but also they have retarded their capacity to use it. That's the thing, because they've become so good at psychological warfare, it's kind of a poisoned chalice, because they've commandeered all of these traditional political and even military systems with these tactics, to the point now where the military leadership of the United States military looks completely incompetent. I don't think they would have the capacity. They were murmuring about challenging the Russians in Ukraine. I think they're not going to do anything because they would get absolutely destroyed if they tried. And the same with Taiwan and the Chinese. The American military seems more interested in trying to promote trannies to high positions than actually figuring out how to win wars at this point.
One of the streams I did a while back with my buddy Pharaoh is that we looked at army recruitment adverts over the ages, and also between nations as well, to see what they were appealing to. And from around the late 90s onwards, both the British and American ads seemed to switch from... there was a heavy emphasis on like skills that you could gain in the army in the 80s. And the 90s, and also like obviously a streak of patriotism and serving your country and all of that. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, it switched to like see the sights. Look at all the experiences you can have, and invariably there would be like a cut to like a group of girls having fun, on a night out. It's like, yeah, this is why you join the army. It's like, sorry, Owen, I don't want to dominate things, but there were two other issues I wanted to point to.
Of course, the British Army, like the Special Forces, does kind of indirectly advertise through. I can't remember the name of that television program is quite famous, and they have it on television here.
Yes,
and so that kind of functions as. The British SAS is probably pound for pound the best military unit in the world, according to many analysts, and they just did like a war game against the Americans and absolutely destroyed the American Special Forces. So maybe that actually says something interesting.
My wife watches that show, and it is really hard. Like they show them like under psychological torture for 8 to 10 hours. They try to put and it doesn't matter if it's men or women or anything. I have watched that show. My wife is pretty into it. I just watch it out the corner of my eye on occasion, and it does seem like there's no element of that. There's very little pod in that particular program that you're talking about. I think it's called SAS Who Dares Win or something like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they do use it to recruit. Sorry, Joel. I had two other things I wanted to raise, but I realised that Owen hasn't spoken for a while, so I just didn't want to monopolise.
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in with what you guys have been saying, and like, thinking of like the element of like social revolution, which in the book Michelle's is like quite pessimistic about the idea of like a genuine revolution occurring. How political parties within a state, or we're going to talk about like the global scene, states within a global system, will maintain kind of a metastability. Like once they've formed like a large-scale powerful bureaucracy, there's a tendency to maintain that, where any sort of revolutionary force that gains momentum doesn't really like overthrow the existing bureaucracy, it just kind of merges with it. And any sort of large-scale conflict between factions within the bureaucracy usually results in like a reconciliation, because they recognize that it's in their shared interest to maintain the current structure, to not like disrupt it too much, because they would be unlikely to maintain power after that. And yet, revolutions of a sense do seem to occur. There are these like large-scale qualitative shifts. If you look at like over the course of centuries, let's say. And I was just thinking, as you guys were talking about the relationship between parts within a system, like what causes that to occur? Like at one point in the book, Michelle's talking about like anarchists and how they have this like incredibly naive view of like, if we just like stop believing in government, basically it will go away. And he points out like, the foolishness of this, because the logical problem of anarchism is like you would need some force to be able to maintain the anarchist state, to be able to ensure that nothing rises up to seize power. So you would basically need a very powerful, central authority to resist the formation of state. And I think that's why a lot of like anarchist sort of idealistic romantic fantasies rely on some like greater social force, like like reaching peak oil, or global warming happens, and like there's just a wide-scale collapse of civilization, because it's a force that's basically bigger than the bureaucracy, right? It's like the will of God. It's an act of nature which overthrows the existing structure.
Mosca does. See, the thing is that I think Michelle's takes. I don't know if he says it anywhere, but he basically takes everything that's in Mosca, to some extent, Pareto as well, for granted, right? He's like, all that stuff, yes, but now let's like look at how, let's zoom in, basically. But Mosca does. I mean, let me see if I can pull up the exact quotation here, because when it comes to these sorts of changes, like changes of elites, whether it's a peaceful circulation, as usually happens in British history, or a violent one, as happens in French history most of the time, he does say. I mean, let's just have a look. So I can control F so I can get to this passage. He says, as soon as there is a shift in the balance of forces, then the manner in which the ruling class is constituted changes also. If a new source of wealth develops in a society, if a practical importance of knowledge grows, if an old religion declines or a new one is born, if a new current of ideas spreads, then simultaneously far-reaching dislocations occur to the ruling class. So Mosca basically just says, like, listen, there's a whole bunch of factors that could cause social and political change to happen. And this is what I was coming back to. These guys are never monocausal, right? Marx wants the sole driver of history to be economic, right? Pareto, to a certain extent, Pareto is a bit more monocausal, because he basically says, yeah, all of this stuff, but ultimately it comes down to these sentiments, which are the real drivers type thing. But Moscow and Michelle's are both kind of rejectors of what is known as the single factor fallacy, and that's because I think they are ultimately historians, right? And I think that anyone who's a kind of honest historian rather than an ideologue or a theorist who has like one thing they want to push will recognise that there's any number of things that can cause change to happen. Machiavelli has a wonderful passage somewhere where he says, "Listen, you can have all the best plays, all the best plans in the world, but fortune is like a river, and all of your plans can come to naught overnight. There's some black swan event that could basically overturn your plans in a heartbeat." Act of God, basically. So these are all things that I think, as realists, these guys kind of acknowledge. However, I have a question which relates to this. I'll just try to bring it in the interest of the discussion, where I say so they have this tendency where they're a bit vague sometimes on what is the prime mover, because they accept different causes. And I've just written here, political leaders therefore enjoy an advantage in knowledge, communication methods, and political skills over the mass, in whom, as we've seen already, Michel considers all three resources to be totally lacking. This offers a great advance over Marxist analysis, which posits that leaders only enjoy their position by virtue of ownership of the means of production. Michel is suggesting that it is the abilities of the leaders to organise through these three resources that justifies and maintains their position. This will become significant when we come to consider James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, because in this are the seeds for the takeover of the managers of fieldcraft we've already discussed. However, if organisational ability, rather than land or business ownership, is the criteria by which leaders are chosen, then it stands to reason that the managers would come to challenge and displace the power of the bourgeoisie, just as the bourgeoisie displaced the old aristocracy. However, in both Mosca and Michel, the role of the rich is somewhat hazy. It is certainly the case that wealth can be used to buy influence and power, but it is not clear whether the fact of ownership can trump the practical realities of organisation. When Michel broaches this topic, he talks mainly about the extent to which old leaders are distrustful of and often unwilling to cede power to new upstarts, which frequently leads to censorship, curbing of free speech. Again, it seems that organisation is the decisive factor, even if wealth can grant certain advantages. Now, the reason I wanted to pause on that is because if we look at the current situation, Joel mentioned at one point prospect for him, like, let's say he wants to set up a Washington think tank or whatever. The first thing that he would have to think about is, well, where am I going to get the money to do it? How many millions of dollars do you need to do it? Who are your financial backers going to be? And I watched Warbuck's video recently on Spengler, where he was talking about the influence of the press and the fact that the press basically is the mechanism by which the mind of the masses is controlled, or the parameters of what is allowable is. And Warbuck used this phrase, the money power, the money power, which is was favoured by Spengler and various other people. And I have a question on this because, I mean, yes, organisation, yes, managers, but this was something that came out in Mo Rothbard's analysis of James Byrne and Sam Francis that was released by the Mises Institute recently, where he was saying, like, yeah, but hold on, the Rockefeller Foundation gave billions of dollars to this person, or there's usually a rich man with purse strings behind a lot of these things as well. Or today, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation stands behind the Tony Blair Institute, or various other institutes.
Well,
so how do we, us, three of us here, resolve this today?
Yeah, I got a few things to say about this because, for one, generally there's a conflation between money power and economic interest, in the sense that, yes, obviously there are wealthy donors behind political movements, but this does not mean that they are simply donating money in order to reinforce their wealth, as though they're just purely interested in profit maximization or something, on like maintaining, because it stands to reason that these the billionaire class actually have political opinions, actually care about achieving certain political goals, but they aren't purely just economic agents. Number two, it also stands to reason that if you're a billionaire and you're making decisions about how to allocate funding in terms of like political donating to different political movements, your donations are still going to be informed by your advisors, which are going to be essentially trained in some sense to become experts or to get in a position to advise you. So presumably they've been trained by the academy, they are experts in something, and you're still giving your money to an organizational apparatus that you don't control. So yes, in a sense you have a selective function, but you don't have a control function, and there's a difference between selection and control. So Rockefeller Foundation can allocate money to you, not allocate money to you, make decisions about who gets the money, but they can't make decisions about exactly how that money is put to use, because it requires management, right? And that management has a certain agenda. And so there is obviously an incentive for the ruling class to maintain its position, but that maintenance of position is not, I don't think, some individual process whereby, Peter Thiel, he just wants to maintain Peter Thiel's position, and Rockefellers, they want to maintain the Rockefellers' position. I think it makes more sense to imagine that there is a orthodoxy, or maybe multiple competing orthodoxies, of how to run the government, and the wealthy elites select amongst them. So, for example, like the Rockefellers, there's a really good article that I posted about on my Telegram recently, written by Kerry Moulton, talking about the so-called Anglo-American conspiracy. He was shitting all over this common conspiracy theory, like the Alex Jones narrative of history, that like the British imperial elites, like Cecil Rhodes and like the Round Table Group described by Carol Quigley, that they somehow control the CFR and the American government and the world through some convoluted means. And he was saying, he was poking all these holes in that narrative, and generally it rests upon the collaboration between the Rockefellers and the British imperialists in the late 19th, late 20th century, not Rockefellers, sorry, Rothschilds, I should say. The point that he was making was that yes, the Rothschilds did lend some support, but that's because they were, elite British citizens at the time, so it makes sense that they would support British imperialism. Wealthy elites supported the imperialism of all the states that are across Europe, like the Dutch, wealthy Dutchmen supported Dutch imperialism, wealthy Frenchmen supported French imperialism, and so forth. And so the point that he was making was that there was, like, he showed all these examples that the Rothschilds weren't necessarily, like, super all about British imperialism and the British imperial project, and they were willing to throw their lots in with the Americans against the British imperial interest in the Second World War's aftermath. And so they were willing to jump ship from one empire to another, basically, when a better deal was given. And so they didn't necessarily have loyalty, though, to supporting the best game in town. Also, you have the example of the NSDAP, when Uncle Adolf comes to power in Germany. He gets a lot of support from many of, like, the wealthy oligarchs and wealthy capitalists or whatever in German society. And then, Marxists make this point then that fascism is capitalism in decay, and the rise to power of the National Socialists was on behalf of capitalism, defense against communism. But if you read Henry Ashby Turner's book, on the subject, you know that that's completely false. It was only after the NSDAP started getting themselves into a position of power that a lot of the wealthy interests, moneyed interests in Germany played ball. And so it was more the case of, well, these guys have political power, so we're going to give them money and get on their good side, so they didn't screw us over, basically, as opposed to we want to fund them into power because they had very little support prior to gaining power. And so basically, like I bring up all these examples because the point is that donating to like political projects isn't something that's simply done in order to enable a political project to succeed, but it's also done to gain favor from political elites because ultimately political elites have power over over the rich. You know, they can go after them. They actually, like the state is able to take on moneyed interest, and it's many times in history where it has. I mean, brutal like examples like Soviet Russia or something, but there are many examples in history of conflict between political elites and dominant economic classes. We see this in Juvenal's On Power. That's basically what nationalism in its various forms and socialism in its various forms has traditionally always been. It's this kind of competition between a political and economic class interest. So one solution that the dominant economic class has is to buy off political elites, make them dependent, make them friendly, and they get favors. So I think that also has to be taken into consideration, and also overall what needs to be taken into consideration in the overarching sense is that the political agenda, the orthodoxy of the state, is a very complex process that no one person has agency over. It's a complex system that emerges from various different actors and inputs in complex structural relation with one another. It's a non-linear system in my view. There's one person changing how they act causes a chain reaction of different reactions across the system. And so like any kind of monocausal theory of the political is highly flawed, which is why I think we need to kind of look more into chaos theory and into theories of emergence and so forth and understanding sociology in order to counter this. So my point in saying this is that yes, the dominant economic classes do perform a selection mechanism on policy making and political establishment. I talk about this in my article in First Fest 3. But also, so does the state. So, for example, how much money does like the Pentagon and like Pentagon-related institutions put into funding, and U.S. State Department and the CIA and all these other institutions put into funding political movements, psychological operations, and so forth? And we know for a fact that the CIA was instrumental in the rise of the neoconservatives, that the U.S. State Department was instrumental in the rise of the New Left in the 1960s, the emergence of critical theory and post-structuralism in France, for a bunch of French intellectuals and so forth. So the state itself and political elites that are in charge of the state, they have a lot of agency over distributing funding as well, things that they like. So again, it's a very complex set of relations. So yes, you have to factor in the selective capacity of billionaires, of what you call like activist investors, like Keith Woods had a great video recently on Peter Singer taking over Twitter, and some ideological motives there. Or there's various, if you look at the interests of different Wall Street bankers, Wall Street investment firms, getting their people on the boards of directors of institutions like Black Lives Matter, or the Rockefeller Foundation, or the Carnegie Foundation, or Ford Foundation, a very clear political agenda. There is a very clear political agenda that is supported by the most wealthy, but there is a managerial aspect to this as well. In order for them to actually construct that strategy, they are reliant upon the academic paradigms that are produced in the academy, and they are reliant upon researchers and strategists and so forth, just like political parties, to kind of come up with their strategy of what they should be funding, what they should be trying to achieve politically, and so forth. And so again, you can't subordinate the political class to their donors. Their relationship is far more complex than that. So anyway, I don't know what you think about that.
Owen?
Yeah, I do think that this is like as I was saying earlier, like how you actually see like revolutionary shifts, like if you want to like rule out these romantic notions of society collapsing all at once, like it's not like some lightning strike that just causes massive change. Rather, what you see is these like step-by-step shifts that lead to unforeseen consequences. Because, like you were saying, Joel, like the political system, especially now, is so incredibly complex that even if you're one of these like super elites playing 5D chess with like your team of advisors and access to great financial power and the ability to like plan ahead 10 moves, you won't be able to see ahead 50 moves. So I think like what you see is that powerful actors, be they institutions, parties, wealthy individuals, think tanks, etc., will initiate something at one moment, perhaps with the intention, as Michelle says, of maintaining kind of the metastability of the bureaucracy, of not tilting boat too much and just sort of keeping things level and functioning as they always have. But inevitably what happens is what they do has unforeseeable ramifications. Like, for instance, what the American Empire, as you guys were saying earlier, doing since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this move to like psychological warfare and perhaps these corporate interests using like woke agendas and things like that for their interests. And even if you go further back, like the empowering of China in the war against the Soviet Union, all of these things in the short term look like they play some sort of advantageous role. But as we're seeing now, I think like this seems to be turning against them. And there's this tendency, especially on the right, to attribute, I think, to the elites undue intelligence. To say like, oh, this is all part of some master plan. They've been planning this since like the dawn of time. This is all just like part of their machinations, and I don't think that's true at all. I think like a lot of these state actors, even the most intelligent ones, are looking like a few moves ahead and doing things that are advantageous a few moves ahead, but they can't predict the butterfly effect of these things, like the long-term ramifications and how that will twist and mutate and lead to genuine qualitative changes in the system, which certainly aren't in their interest and perhaps weren't in anyone's particular interest. All that to say, like, that's a bit of a, it's a black pill and a white pill. On the one hand, it removes this idea that there's like this, new world order globalist elite who are just like moving every piece on the chessboard and have total control over everything. But on the other hand, it makes me wonder to what degree anyone, any group, no matter how well equipped they are, can actually, initiate something that endures, that isn't inevitably going to lead to a chaotic fluctuation. In any case, I do think there's a lot of research that needs to be done here, as academic agent was saying earlier. Taking this idea of the oligarchic dependency of any one group and expanding it to look at the actual interrelation between different groups and how that informs like particular choices they make.
Aspect of this, to bring in quickly before we throw it back to AA, was what we were saying before the subject where you were talking about the American elites, and I was saying I think they overmaxed on psyop capacity, where it's eroded their more conventional political capacity, because this relates to what Owen was saying about like the elites. People attribute them more agency than they actually have, like everything's going to plan, when actually the system is so complex that it's impossible for any one agent to have that kind of control. Just from a cybernetic standpoint, it's impossible. Is that I think that's what we see, where the emphasis of a particular kind of strategy that suited the Americans for a particular phase has had all of this blowback. Different things, like basically cucking the Japanese from gaining economic strength in the 80s and the 90s has led to the Chinese situation. Basically destroying the old conservative movement in the United States in the 50s and the 60s by bringing in a bunch of Trotskyists and neocons to replace them because they were more in line with America's foreign policy goals, has totally undermined the American conservative movement, put it under the control of Zionists that pushed them into a bunch of stupid wars like the Iraq War that made no strategic sense. They've completely upended America's capacity to maintain global hegemony, wasting resources on a war that made no strategic sense whilst allowing the rise of China, whilst losing control of Europe, etc. So what you see is people make one move, but then that ends up having ramifications 3-4 moves down the track that they've anticipated at the time. And so I think that's kind of has been what's happened with maxing cyber capacity. We saw with Biden winning the election. This is an example of their cyber capacity. I have to be careful about what I say about this election because I can get my channel nuked from YouTube. But so they were very effective in
their... It was the freest, fairest, most fortified election in US history. Yeah.
But the thing is that they were so effective at securing the W. However you want to say, they did it. They were very, from a strategic standpoint, from a real politics standpoint, very effective strategy in taking the W in 2020. But since they get into power, they've done an absolutely terrible job of actually governing. These people can't govern. They're very, very good at. They optimized at undermining. Undermining the state, undermining the political authority. They can't wield it correctly. And so now if you look at the polls, they're getting rinsed, and then they're almost dead certain to lose the midterms, and they're almost certain to lose in 2024. Republicans literally just don't do anything, don't say anything, and just let them make a mess of it. And the Democrats are like, we don't even know who, there's a problem with Biden, but anyone else we could run is even less popular than he is, and they can't accomplish anything in terms of their reform agenda. It's a total mess. They're losing prestige all over the world, losing control of all of these different other parts of the world, different regions of the world, and they're doing a terrible job of governing, of actually ruling, because they were optimized for undermining rule. Because that's how they dominated the world, because they undermined a whole bunch of these different regimes, and they used those tactics against Trump. And now that's all they know how to do is undermine rule, but not rule. So it's like you optimize one capacity and you end up sabotaging another, and it'll be their downfall.
I do think, Joel, just to come back to the things, I do think that the taking the W, as you said, was not cost-free. I think a significant number of people in America no longer buy into the political formula of America. I.e., they no longer believe that the system functions as it should, and those myths, the myth of the political formula, i.e., that the government is for the, you're governed by the people, for the people, right? This is the big American dream. I do think that, regardless of what the facts on the ground are, okay, regardless of what you believe about it or anybody else believes about it, the fact remains a significant number of people do not believe the official narrative, let's just say, on the election. And I think that in and of itself represents a problem for the American ruling class, because any ruling class is only as strong as their political formula, right? As soon as the ruled no longer sign up to that, it's only a matter of time before they figure out, well, we need to organise and replace that.
But even if they pissed off conservatives and like in the way they did, if they came in and they got the economy going, and that whole idea of the adults will be in the room, that was the narrative they gave to leftists, was Biden, he's a little cringe, he's a little bit of a spaz, but the Biden administration is going to be far, far better, and we're going to return to this kind of proper, like we had under Obama, this the American ruling class will be back in charge, and we'll do business as usual, get the economy going again, we'll get international relations sorted, foreign policy will make sense, and they've come in and they've done, the economy has been rubbish, and foreign policy has been one embarrassment after another.
I tell you something else that's been that it's funny actually coming back to Michelle as well, is that there's a whole chapter in Michelle when he talks about how the old guard protect their position against the younger aspirants, as he calls them, the upstarts, right? And that that there's always a dynamic. And again, he's talking about socialist parties most of the time, but I mean, he could write it right as well. But he just so happens to be talking about socialists, and he says that there's a number of tricks that the old guard use against the young aspirants. And you know, in my lecture, I just couldn't help but think when he was reading about that, about the old guard in the Democrat Party, because they're so old, right? They're all in their 70s and 80s, right? I mean, literally ancient. You know, Biden, Pelosi, Schumer, Elizabeth Warren is in her 70s, even like Bernie Sanders is in the 70s, right? And the young aspirants are obviously like, you know, the SWAT, you know, the AOC, forget the names of the others, Presley, the Omar, forget the name of the last one, Rashid or something. And every single trick that Michelle's outlined in this chapter, I have seen the old guard Democrats use against the SWAT. You know, we're the adults in the room, you guys are extremists, you're irresponsible, you know, subordination and party discipline is ultimately important. And we have seen, like, regardless of what people on the right may think of it, we have seen the AOC and co being like cut by Pelosi like 7, 8, 9 times now, like publicly told off. And I just think that if they have a problem from the outside, i.e., if they present themselves as the adults in the room against like Trump or whatever, but also internally, because how long before the Democrat base say, well, hold on a second, you keep on telling us you're the adults, and you're like, it's a shit show. Like, so it's almost, I mean, Plato doesn't say it's just everything's like a ruse, but I suppose it does depend on actually being good at organising. To your point, Joel, you actually have to be good at these things in order for that message to carry on.
It's like, yeah, like the United States government can have the biggest military budget in the world and throw incredible resources at Lockheed Martin and all these other military-industrial complex organizations. But if they keep wasting it and building overpriced junk, then it doesn't matter. If the Chinese are spending half of the Americans are spending, but they actually have competent industry building their aircraft carriers and their, you know, their hypersonic missiles and, you know, their fighter jets and so forth. You know, just sheer material, sheer wealth can't necessarily get you over the line. You actually have to have organization, right? And it's the same, I think, when it comes to political. Like, yeah, you can have these massive institutions throwing money at different political ventures, but if you have incompetent strategy, if you have incompetent administration, you're just pissing that money up the wall. You're not going to actually get, you're still not going to accomplish your goals. I mean, obviously money helps, but it's not as though you can just go dollars in, political power out. It's not that simple. So,
I mean, do you actually think, Joel, we're seeing like higher lane as an action? We're just, the regime is just down to so many like people who are. I've been reading like Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann and people like this recently as well for this course that I went to. One of the things that struck me time and again is just how inept current propagandists are, you know, versus the Bernays, like how subtle and kind of, you know, how good he was at manipulation, as compared with what we see today, where it's just sort of kind of clunky and inept and ends up pissing off half the audience and all this sort of stuff. I just think they're bad. You know, they're just like the elites are just they're lacking in they're increasingly lacking in exactly those skills that Michelle's points to in the party. They're not persuaded. I mean, why do we exist? We shouldn't exist. None of the three of us should exist. We should just be, you know, card carrying liberal Democrats. But this is they've actively succeeded in turning three of us against them, you know, by being inept at persuasion. Am I wrong?
I mean, I think that's true when you're talking about like the, you know, like CNN or something, MSNBC, New York Times type egregious propaganda. But I think there's more subtle propagandists on the right that have been very effective at recuperating the rejection of that energy and the production of, you know, really retarded conspiracy theory discourse. I mean, obviously, I'm not like anti all conspiracy theories, because a lot of them are true. But you know, you're seeing this proliferation of just because you disagree with the official narrative doesn't mean your narrative isn't also wrong, you know what I mean? And there's a proliferation of bad narratives on the right that have recuperated a lot of the energy, the dissident energy, I think, as well, quite effectively.
There's a difficult path to kind of, because I understand exactly the what you guys are trying to say here. The trouble we have is that because the what Mike from Imperium Press calls the anarchistic view of the world, you know, the accidental view of history, is so prevalent and so powerful. You know, I spend a lot of time arguing with the Tory boys on Twitter, for example, and that narrative is so strong that the very suggestion of minority organisation, for example, in itself is seen in the realm of conspiracy theory. It's just like, well, hold on, how does anybody, you know? So these things that Michelle's is talking about here. The
problem isn't conspiracy theory. The problem is a lack of epistemic integrity, where people say, oh well, this doesn't feel right, and so they then presume, like there's a smuggling in of, because this is what you get when you have when you basically have a mass media system that is just driven by, I think, clicks, right? So if you can come up with a narrative that's very emotionally, that's what good propaganda is. Good propaganda is it activates the emotions of the target, and so I think a lot of this, like for example, Alex Jones, who I think is incredibly entertaining. Probably one of the most entertaining human beings alive in the world today. I could watch that guy for hours. He is one of the great propagandists, you know what I mean, like of our time. And that's what I mean, like people like this, that they're so effective, and they're so likable, that you know that they're bullshitting you a little bit, but you still want to watch it anyway, almost, like, because they're just so likable. There's many figures like this.
That's what I was going to go on to say, Joel. So on the one hand, you get people who just outright deny that there could be anybody with an agenda trying to affect things, right? On the one hand, and then in the other extreme case, you have the conspiracy theorists who. It's almost like the system can never take an L. But like everything is planned. I remember this around the time of Afghanistan. It's like, oh well, you've got to understand that this was the plan all along to be there for 20 years and leave. You know? So it's like, I mean, I don't know what you do with that though, because they're both people end up somehow on the right, with the total anarchist and the person with the totally emergent, you know, accidental view of history, and then the person with the, you know, everything is a plan by 52 chess Rothschilds masters.
Yeah, well, it's also that, but it's also the some of the conspiracy theories are obfuscations as well. So, like, for example, Alex Jones, he's very careful not to ever implicate Zionists in a whole bunch of things. And, you know, you can actually see evidence that he knows better, because you can find videos on Odyssey of him and his radio show back in the 2000s where he called out Zionist infiltration of the American government. And you can see him counter-signal that and blame, like, there was that really famous video that Keith Wood and I have been making fun of, where he stopped himself from saying Jews and said West Germans, like West German intellectuals. And so we've been calling them West Germans, like, you know, like...
Wait, didn't he have a debate on this in recent time? I feel like somebody confronted him about it and he had a debate about it recently. I could be wrong about that.
I don't know about recently. There was the famous time when he had David Duke on his show many years ago, and they debated the subject. David Duke is a little bit of a crank on some of these issues as well, but nevertheless it was interesting. But like my point is that it's not as though I'm averse to conspiracy theories. I mean, I believe in a lot of them, but it's like it's more complicated than this. It's not just like conspiracy versus non-conspiracy. It's more just like the actual specifics of what happened, what didn't happen. And you're right that there is this, obviously there's mainstream versions of anything that sounds like a conspiracy theory must be false, which is ridiculous. Like this idea that no one conspires, no one organizes to do anything, that doesn't make any sense at all, just like in principle. But also you have this kind of emotivist, you know, feelings-based or just frankly just bad history, just, you know, bad readings of history, bad takes where they apply Marxist analysis, or they apply you know, various other kind of copes that are just historically inaccurate narratives of history. That, you know, basically what you can only really engage that epistemically and say, well, look, your narrative of history is wrong. Here's why this is actually the best way to understand this. So,
yeah, I mean, I've also noticed a tendency on, you know, I call them kooks, and I got to know some of these guys over the course of the US election. You know, it was a hell of a lot of fun for some of us to follow along. It was just so crazy a couple of months. But you know, every once in a while I check back in and see what's the president or what. But one of the tendencies...
The rest are coming. Patriots in control, you know.
Yeah, Patriots in control, yeah. That's the plan. One of the tendencies I've noticed with these sorts of guys, though, is the need to tie everything in. So they will always mention JFK, for example. They will always, like... And also the need to say it's always been the same actors through history. So now you're basically, like, going all the way back to the French Revolution. And it's like, you know, it's the same people all the time. You know, I don't mean that's the particular ethnic group that you had in mind, but you know, this secret society or that secret society, and the need just to have this one story that explains all things. I find again, usually when you start doing that, you're not really doing history anymore, because then like nothing is believable, you know, like nothing that happened is ever real. When you get to that sort of thing,
yeah,
everybody becomes somebody's control opposition.
Just like part of it is just low IQ and schizophrenia type things, and part of it is just, yeah, but that's the effective thing about propaganda. I mean, even Uncle Adolf, obviously, you know, the National Socialists had very effective propaganda, and you know, they make the point that, well, obviously, you know, you can't boil everything down to the JQ, but we don't want to confuse, you know, the people, so we might as well. I mean, it's a lot of stuff does, so we might as well just make be reductionist about it, because we don't want to confuse people and get people distracted on other issues or whatever. So like that, and that obviously was quite effective for them. And you can see even today that there is a portion of people online. I mean, I am someone who is let's say red-pilled on the subject, but it's never enough for some people. Like, you know, you've got to, they get obsessive about it to the point where it's pathological. Even if they are right, they're right for the wrong reasons, kind of, because they have this pathological fixation on the issue that they become obsessive. Everything has to fit into their categories of the world. These are the bad guys that are responsible for everything wrong. And obviously, like, you know, that again, like I said, the real problem is epistemic integrity when we're trying to do good theory, and you know, that's just an emotional fixation, and that's what you get with a lot of discourse around lots of different issues today with conservatives, is a very emotivist kind of fixation with the world, where if anyone, like I went on the Kill stream yesterday and I was talking about COVID, and I don't support vaccine mandates or lockdowns or any of this stuff. I've spoken out against it since like early 2020, and you know, I was against the narrative very early on. and I made the point that, well, you know, there is a certain amount of sensationalization of Australia, because people always ask me, oh, like, you know, what's it like in Australia? And I'm like, well, I live in the biggest city in Australia, and it's pretty much back to normal. It's not as bad as any other European country. We don't have like lockdowns for the unvaccinated or something that they do in some European countries. Like this idea that Australia is this uniquely authoritarian response. I've seen reports from Canada and other European countries that are way worse than things that have happened here. But then they have this, they're building camps for. But this is again like it's only in one very particular part of the country that I've never even been to in my life, where they have this in the Northern Territory. It's like a fringe occurrence. And like I said, it's just like obviously it's not nice that they do it and I don't support it either. But it's like, okay, you go into this room for 2 weeks and then you go home. It's not like as if like, okay, that's a very annoying thing to have to do, but it's not like as if like, you know, your life's ruined forever because you have to go and stay in this room for 2 weeks. You know, like it's an uncomfortable experience. It's like obviously like they tried to glamorize it and people have like acted silly, like you know like downplaying too much of that Claire Lehman journalist or whatever. But I was like, look, it's, you know, on the whole, it's not like people are overreacting. Like, oh, they're rounding us up into camps. Like, what's next? Like, you know, like as if like the government's gonna round up everyone who gets COVID and put them in a camp forever for what reason? Like, it doesn't even make any sense. And then I said that, and then there's a bunch of people in the comment section who are like, oh, like, I'm like, this guy's ridiculous. All Australians, they're just used to living in chains. They're all like, you know, it's just like all this like ridiculous nonsense. It's like, it just gets so like it doesn't even make any sense. Like,
yeah. No, see, the trouble is though, is that we're living at a time where it would help though if global elites didn't act like they were a satanic cabal. Like if that wasn't so believable, it would it would probably help with some of the.
Well, I'm sure some of them are in the satanic cabal. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily false, but it's just more complicated than that. I mean.
All right, sir. Anything else, Capsule?
No, I think this is a good place to end it. But thanks for coming on. It was great to have you on. You know, hopefully we do something again soon.
The oldest Bell Foundation